The word hit the dusty morning air like a slap across the face. "You're done, Hicks. Pack your gear and get off my land before noon." Luke Mercer stood on the porch of the Double M Ranch house, his jaw set like iron and his gray eyes cold as a January sky. Foreman Dale Hicks stared up at him from the bottom of the steps, hat in hand, face gone white beneath its weathered tan. Behind Hicks, 7 ranch hands had frozen mid-motion, some with coffee cups raised halfway to their lips, some with bridles half-buckled, all of them watching their boss with the stunned stillness of men who had just witnessed lightning strike the very ground they were standing on. "Now listen here," Hicks started, his voice cracking at the edges. "Whatever you heard about the cattle count, it ain't what you think. It is exactly what I think." Luke's voice did not rise. That was the worst part of it. Every man on that yard knew. When Luke Mercer got quiet, the storm had already broken. "I went through the ledger last night. 300 head short over 18 months. You want to stand there and explain to me how 300 cattle just evaporated off my range?" Hicks's mouth worked silently for a moment. Behind him, the hands exchanged glances heavy with things none of them dared say aloud. The dawn light was thin and gold, cutting long shadows across the packed dirt yard, and somewhere out past the corral, a mockingbird sang 3 bright notes into the silence as if it had no idea the world was falling apart. "I can explain," Hicks tried again. "You explained plenty in those ledgers." Luke stepped down one stair, then another, until he was on the ground level, face to face with the man he had trusted for 4 years. "You've been skimming cattle and selling them to the Donner spread across the county line. I've got the records of the sales. I've got the dates. I've got your signature on invoices that never passed through my books." He let that settle. "So I am going to say this one more time, Dale. Pack your things. Get off my property. And pray I don't take this to the sheriff's office in redemption before you're clear of the county." That last sentence, that was the betrayal Luke felt most deeply. Not the money, though Lord knew the Double M was stretched thin enough that losing those cattle could mean the difference between surviving the coming winter or not. It was the 4 years of handshakes and shared meals, and the quiet faith he had placed in a man he thought was honest. It was the dark past he had worked so hard to escape, the days when he himself had trusted the wrong people and paid for it with everything he owned the first time around, rising back up to remind him that trust was always, always a trap. Hicks was gone within the hour. He did not look back. The hands drifted back to their work with the subdued, careful movements of men who understood that something serious had just happened, and that the ranch they depended upon for their livelihoods was now running without a foreman. Luke stood alone by the fence rail, one boot up on the lower board, staring out at his land, 3,000 acres of Texas grass and mesquite, and sky that stretched from here to the edge of everything, and he let himself feel the full weight of it. The ranch was his entire life. He had rebuilt it from literal ashes 7 years ago, after the flood of 1879 that had wiped out the original Mercer homestead and killed his father, and left him at 22 years old with nothing but the deed to waterlogged land and a stubbornness that some men called courage and others called recklessness. He was 29 now in the summer of 1886, and he had built this place back up with his own hands and with men he trusted, and one of those men had been secretly burning him down from the inside for a year and a half. He had sent a letter to a placement agency in San Antonio 6 weeks ago, requesting a ranch manager. He had expected a man. He had written the word man explicitly in his letter, he was nearly certain. He had pictured someone grizzled and experienced, someone who had run cattle operations before, someone who could step into the chaos Hicks had left and impose order the way a boot imposes order on wet clay. He had not expected the stagecoach that rolled into the Double M yard at 9:30 that same morning to deposit Alice Langley onto his property. But that was where the story truly began, not with the firing, not with the betrayal, but with the moment Luke Mercer turned from the fence rail at the sound of the stagecoach wheels, and saw a woman climb down from the coach step with a leather satchel in one hand and a rolled leather document case under her arm, wearing a dark green riding skirt and a white shirtwaist with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, and she looked around his yard with calm, assessing eyes like someone arriving to take an inventory rather than someone stepping off a long, hot, dusty journey through the Texas brush country. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped a man cold and made him forget himself. She was something more dangerous than that. She was the kind of woman whose face you looked at and thought, without quite meaning to, she knows exactly what she is doing. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up with practical efficiency, and her eyes were a clear, direct hazel that in certain lights looked almost amber. She was perhaps 26 or 27, fine-boned but not fragile, and there was a self-possession about her that reminded Luke of the best cow-horses he had ever ridden, balanced, attentive, and not easily spooked. She spotted him across the yard before he could speak and walked directly toward him with her hand extended. "Mr. Mercer, I am Alice Langley. Mr. Beaumont's agency in San Antonio sent me. I believe you are expecting a ranch manager." Luke took her hand automatically. It was the firmest handshake he had received in years from anyone, man or woman. "I was expecting someone else," he said, and immediately regretted both the words and the tone of them. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a sharpening, a noting. "I imagine you were. Men usually are." She released his hand and looked past him toward the yard, the bunkhouse, the corrals, the barn, and the eastern pasture beyond. "I can see from here that your south fence line needs restringing and that two of your horses in the near corral are favoring their left fronts. Before we discuss my qualifications, would you like to address whatever just happened this morning?" The men looked shaken, and a shaken crew is an unproductive crew. Luke stared at her. "How do you know something happened this morning?" She gave him the quietest possible smile. "Because you are standing in the middle of your yard at 9:30 looking like a man who just cut off his own hand, and because every single one of your ranch hands keeps looking at you and then looking away again, which is what men do when they witness something they do not quite know how to process." She set her satchel down on the nearby post rail with an unhurried motion. "What happened?" he told her. He had not intended to tell her. He had not intended to tell anyone in that kind of raw, unguarded way. But there was something about the directness of her question and the steadiness of her gaze that pulled the words out of him before he could organize them into a version of the story that preserved his dignity. He told her about Hicks and the ledgers and the 300 cattle and the 4 years of misplaced trust. And when he finished, Alice Langley nodded once slowly, the way a doctor nods when a diagnosis confirms what they already suspected. "So you have a full crew, no foreman, a ledger system that was clearly being manipulated, and a cattle count that needs to be verified against your range numbers before you can assess the actual financial damage," she said. "That's the shape of it. All right." She picked up her satchel. "Where is the bunkhouse? I would like to leave my things there, and then I would like to meet the crew." Luke opened his mouth. Then he closed it. "I haven't decided whether I'm hiring you," he said, which was not precisely true but felt necessary. Alice looked at him with those amber hazel eyes that somehow managed to be both patient and completely intolerant of nonsense. "Mr. Mercer, you are standing here without a foreman, with a demoralized crew, cattle unaccounted for on your range, and a ledger system in need of a full audit. I have managed ranch operations in New Mexico and Kansas. I speak enough Spanish to communicate with vaqueros, and I know how to read a land survey. You can interview me at your leisure, but I am going to suggest that your leisure does not currently exist, and that the best use of the next hour is getting your crew pointed in the right direction before they spend the rest of the day standing around trying to figure out what their jobs are without anyone at the helm." She tilted her head slightly. "So, the bunkhouse, which direction?" Luke pointed. He was not sure when he had lost control of this conversation, but he suspected it was approximately 30 seconds after it began. Alice nodded, took her satchel, and walked across the yard with the purposeful stride of a woman who had already, privately, taken the job. She found the crew collected in loose, uncertain clusters near the barn, the 7 hands who had witnessed the morning's events, their work energy scattered like startled cattle with nowhere obvious to move. Their names, she would learn in the coming days, were as distinct as the men themselves. There was Hector Reyes, the wiry, dark-eyed Mexican-born vaquero who had been with the Double M longest after Hicks, and whose knowledge of the open range was the kind that came only from a lifetime of riding it. There was Tommy Briggs, who was 21 and still learning, and who wore his hat at an angle that told you everything you needed to know about his relationship with authority. There was Pete Callahan, broad-shouldered and quiet, who communicated largely through meaningful silences and the occasional grunt. There was Enrique Vargas, who was Hector's cousin and who could shoe a horse faster than any man on the range. There was Bill Sandover, who was 50 and had forgotten more about cattle management than most men ever knew, and who distrusted change the way the old-timers distrusted clouds on a clear day. There was Jimmy Creek, mixed blood, half Cherokee, who said almost nothing and saw almost everything. And there was Roy Anders, who was large and fair and reliable in the way that a good, heavy work table is reliable, exactly where you put it and exactly what you put on it. Alice set down her satchel by the barn door, looked at the 7 of them and said, "Good morning. I am Alice Langley. I will be managing operations here going forward. I need someone to tell me the current state of the South Pasture fence line, the status of the cattle grazing rotation, and whether the morning feed for the horses has been completed." There was a beat of silence. Hector was the first to answer. He stepped forward with the natural authority of a man who respected competence wherever it appeared and said, "The south fence has been down along the creek bend for about 2 weeks. Mr. Hicks kept saying he would get to it. Morning feed is done. Rotation schedule, we have not been following one. Mr. Hicks moved them when he felt like it." "Good, thank you." Alice turned to look at all of them. "South fence gets repaired today." "I need 3 men on that, Hector. Will you lead that?" She looked at him directly. Hector straightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, ma'am." "Bill, I need you to take 2 men and do a pasture count of the East Range. I want actual numbers, every head accounted for, written down." She reached into her leather document case and produced a pre-ruled counting sheet. She had brought her own and handed it to Bill Sandover. He took it with the automatic response of a man who was given clear orders by someone who knew what they were doing. "Roy, Pete, I want the barn inventoried. Feed stores, equipment condition, everything. I need a list by midday." She looked at Tommy Briggs, who was staring at her with undisguised fascination. "Tommy, what job were you assigned this morning before the change in situation?" Tommy blinked. Supposed to check the windmill on the North Ridge." "Then go check it. Take Jimmy with you. I want to know if it needs repairs." Jimmy Creek said nothing, but he picked up his hat from the fence post and put it on, which was, Alice would come to learn, his version of an enthusiastic yes. She turned back to the group. "I know this morning was disorienting. Change usually is. I am not going to pretend that nothing happened, because you are all intelligent adults and pretending would waste everyone's time. What I will tell you is that this ranch has good land, solid cattle, and a capable crew, and my job is to make sure all 3 of those things are working the way they should. I will need your help to do that, and I want you to know that your work will not go unnoticed." She paused. "Any questions?" Silence. Then Bill Sandover, who had been skeptical from the moment she opened her mouth, said slowly, "You ever managed a cattle operation before, Miss Langley? No offense meant." "None taken. Yes. 3 years at the Hargrove spread outside of Cimarron, New Mexico, and 18 months at the Hammond Ranch in Kansas before that. You are welcome to write to either of those operations for references, but I would suggest you do it after the fence line is repaired and the cattle are counted, since the letters will take 2 weeks and the fence will not wait." Bill Sandover looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, tucked the counting sheet under his arm, and jerked his head at Pete and Enrique. "All right, boys, let's move." Luke Mercer had been standing 10 feet behind Alice during this entire exchange. She had not acknowledged his presence, not because she was being rude, but because she had, with the perfect spatial awareness of someone used to operating on contested ground, correctly assessed that the crew needed to see her authority established without his shadow falling over it. If he had stepped in to validate her, it would have made her borrowed authority. If she could command attention on her own, it became hers. He watched his crew, the crew that had been standing around like lost men an hour ago, pick up their tools and move out with clear direction, and he felt something complicated move through his chest. It was not quite admiration. It was too unsettling for that. It was the feeling you got when you watched someone do something you had not thought possible and realized, in the same moment, that you had been thinking too small. He walked up beside her as the last of the hands departed. "You had no authority to assign my men to tasks," he said. Alice looked at him calmly. "You are correct. Would you like me to call them back and reassign them yourself, or would you like to discuss whether you are going to officially hire me?" He hated that she was right. He hated that there was no waste in her. Every word she said was weighted and placed with the precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that she could not afford the luxury of imprecision. He knew what it cost a woman to work in this world, to learn everything twice as well, and demonstrate it 3 times as clearly and still have half the room looking past her shoulder for a man to confirm what she had just said. He had watched his mother work that way her whole life, and the memory put a different texture on what he was seeing. "I will hire you," he said. "Same terms I offered in the letter, $35 a month, board included." "40, Alice said. He blinked. 40. The man you just fired was taking 40, I would guess, given the length of his tenure and his responsibilities. I have more experience than he did, and I will not steal from you, which makes me considerably more valuable. $40. Luke looked at her for 3 full seconds. "Done," he said, "but you report to me on every major decision." "Naturally." She extended her hand again, and they shook on it a second time. But this time something was different about it. Some small charge under the surface of it that neither of them acknowledged or examined, because they were, both of them, people who understood that survival required keeping your eyes on the horizon. The first week was a revelation. Alice moved through the double M with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years learning how to read a ranch the way other people read books. She was up before the hands every morning, already at the barn by the time the eastern sky turned from black to gray, checking horse feet and water levels and grain stores with a lantern in one hand and a small notebook in the other. She did not issue orders loudly or with drama. She gave directions that were specific and sensible, and when a man followed them and the result was good, she said so plainly. When a man made a mistake, she said that plainly too, without cruelty but without cushioning. The crew's transformation was almost alarming. Bill Sandover, who had spent the first 2 days of Alice's tenure watching her with the narrow-eyed suspicion of a cat confronted with a new piece of furniture, came to her on the 4th day with a question about the rotation schedule that was not really a question. It was an invitation. He was inviting her to demonstrate whether she actually knew what she was doing, and she answered him with a 20-minute walk across the east pasture in which she pointed out 3 specific things she had noticed about the grass coverage and the water table that told her the east herd needed to be moved west within the week, or they would start pulling poor condition going into fall. Bill listened, said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Hicks moved them by the calendar. Never looked at the grass." He said nothing else, but the next morning he brought her coffee without being asked, which, in the language of taciturn Texas cowboys, was a declaration of profound respect. Hector Reyes became her most valuable collaborator from nearly the first day. He had the deep, unassuming competence of a man who had grown up with cattle and would die with cattle, who knew every inch of this range by feel as much as sight, and who had been quietly frustrated for years at having that knowledge go unheeded by Hicks. With Alice, he found someone who asked him the right questions and then listened to the full answer. He told her where the scrub cattle liked to hide in the South Canyon, where the water hole on the west edge was going dry in summer heat, where the fence had been tested by a small neighbor herd for the last 2 seasons. She took notes on everything. By the end of the week, she had a picture of the ranch's real operational state that was clearer and more accurate than anything in the existing ledgers. The ledgers themselves were another matter. Alice sat at the small desk in the ranch office on the second evening. Luke had given her access to the books, with the slightly grim expression of a man handing someone a wound to look at, and spent 4 hours going through 18 months of Hicks's records with a lamp and a pencil. She built her own parallel ledger as she went, cross-referencing sale records against head counts against purchase dates, and by midnight she had a clear picture of both the scope of the theft and, more importantly, of the ranch's actual financial position. She brought her findings to Luke the following morning. He was in the kitchen when she knocked and entered, and he looked up from his coffee with the wary expression he had been wearing around her since she arrived. That expression that said he was not sure whether to trust her, and was mildly furious at himself for not being sure. She laid her summary on the table in front of him. "You lost 187 head over 18 months, not 300, she said. "The count discrepancy comes from a recording error Hicks introduced deliberately to make the total look larger, probably as insurance. If you ever confronted him, he could claim the cattle died on the range rather than that he sold them. The actual market value of the stolen animals is approximately $2,300 at current beef prices." She paused. "You can recover from that. It will be tight this year, but if the fall roundup goes well and we push cattle to market by October, you will be solvent. I have also found what I believe is an error in the water rights documentation for the South pasture that, if corrected, would give you legal access to the Creek Bend water that you have been treating as disputed. That water access alone would be worth more to this ranch than what Hicks took." Luke sat very still, looking at the pages she had laid before him. She could see him processing it, not just the numbers, but the fact that in 1 week she had already found something positive in the wreckage that he had spent 2 days looking at as pure catastrophe. "How did you find the water rights error?" he said at last. "I read the original land survey in your document box and compared it to the county records I had the stage driver pick up from Redemption on his last pass through. The survey uses a benchmark that shifted in 1873 when the county resurveyed after the railroad came through. Your deed is actually broader than you've been treating it." She looked at him directly. "You should speak to a lawyer in Redemption about formalizing it. I can write the summary letter if you like." Luke looked at her for a long moment, and something happened in his expression, a slow relaxation around the eyes and jaw, not quite a smile, but the structural beginning of one. "Miss Langley," he said. "Alice," she said. "There is no need for formality. Alice," he said the name carefully as if testing its weight. "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head. "For what specifically?" "For the morning you arrived. The way I said what I said about expecting someone else. That was rude." Alice considered him for a moment. She was not a woman who accepted apologies automatically just because they were offered. She thought about whether they were deserved and whether the person offering them had understood precisely what they were apologizing for. In this case, she thought he had. "You were having a terrible morning," she said, "and you were honest about your surprise, which is better than pretending. I appreciate the apology. I accept it. That's generous of you. Not particularly. It is practical. We have to work together well, and that works better without grudges." She gathered her papers. "I would like to organize a full ranch meeting this afternoon to go over the fall roundup planning. Will that work for you?" "It will," he said. She was halfway to the door when he said, "How did you end up in this work, truly?" She stopped but did not immediately turn around. It was a personal question, and they had not yet established the kind of ground where personal questions were comfortable. But there was something in his voice, a genuine curiosity that was careful not to be intrusive, that made her turn and look at him. "My father ranched outside of Abilene," she said. He died when I was 17 and left me the property with no hands, no money, and a bank that wanted to foreclose within 6 months. I kept it running for 4 years. I learned everything there was to know because I had no choice, and then I discovered I was good at it. She held his gaze steadily. Then the bank called the note anyway, because the man who held the paper decided he wanted the land for himself and found a technical reason to do it. And there was nothing I could do about it because I had no money for a lawyer and no husband to stand in court for me. She let that sit for just a moment. So I went to work for other people's ranches, because I know this work and I am not willing to do something I am not good at simply because it is considered more suitable. Luke was quiet for a moment, looking at her with something in his eyes that was not pity. She would have walked out the door if it were pity, but something more like recognition. "The man who took the land," he said. "Did anything ever come of that?" "No," Alice said simply. "That is one of the things you learn to carry." She turned back to the door. "I will see you at the afternoon meeting, Mr. Mercer." "Luke," he said quietly, mirroring her earlier instruction. "No need for formality." She paused at the doorway and she did not look back, but he thought, though he could not be sure, that she almost smiled. The afternoon meeting went well. Luke sat at the edge of the group and watched Alice run the roundup planning session with the hands, and he was struck again by the way she worked. The way she made each man feel that his knowledge and opinion had weight. The way she built the plan out of what they already knew rather than imposing something from outside. The way she caught Bill Sandover's eye when he said something genuinely important and held it for a moment with visible acknowledgement, so that he sat up a little straighter and offered more. Luke had managed men his whole adult life. He was good at it, direct, fair, not given to drama or favoritism. But there was an art to what Alice did that was different from his own management in a way he could not quite articulate. It was the difference between running a river and navigating one. Both got you downstream. One went with the current. After the meeting broke up, Tommy Briggs found himself alongside Luke near the corral fence and said, in the tone of someone sharing a significant discovery, "She knows about the North Windmill problem." "How does she know about the windmill problem?" "I told her when I got back that it needed a new sucker rod, and she already knew what size. She had it in her supply list." Luke looked at the young man with the crooked hat. "How old are you, Tommy?" 21. "Then take my advice. Pay attention to everything that woman does and do not waste the lesson." He pushed off the fence and walked away before Tommy could ask what kind of lesson he meant, because Luke was not entirely sure himself. The days fell into a rhythm after that, the way days on a working ranch always do, not a comfortable rhythm, but a functional one, governed by the weight of animal needs and weather and light. The cattle had to be moved, the fence had to be maintained, the water sources had to be monitored, and the endless documentation of all of it had to be kept current, because without current records you were always operating blind. Alice kept the records the way she kept everything, with meticulous, unhurried precision. What Luke had not anticipated was that he would look forward to the morning reports. It was not something he decided to do. It happened gradually, the way water finds a channel not by force, but by the natural slope of things. She was in the office when he came in for his first coffee, which was early. They had fallen into the habit, without ever discussing it, of going over the day's priorities together before the crew was fully assembled. It was efficient, it made sense, and Luke had stopped pretending those were the only reasons after the first week. He liked the way she thought. He liked the precision of it, and the humor that lived quietly underneath it, dry, subtle, never unkind, but there, present in the way she phrased things. On the morning when she had caught Enrique accidentally recording a bay mare twice in the horse count, she had told Luke about it with the perfectly straight face of someone who was not going to make a joke out loud, but was absolutely making the joke internally. He could see it in her eyes. He laughed, and she let herself laugh too, and the sound of it in the quiet morning office was new and warm and sat somewhere in his chest longer than it should have. He caught himself noticing things. The particular way she held her pencil, tilted toward the page at an angle that suggested she had been writing with it since childhood. The small scar on her left wrist that she never explained and he never asked about. The way she looked at a problem not with frustration, but with a kind of focused patience, like a bird waiting at a water hole, knowing that if you were still enough, the thing you needed would come to you. He had not let himself think about a woman in a serious way for a long time. After Alina, after the engagement that had ended 3 years ago when the woman he had expected to marry chose to go east with a banker instead, he had put that particular part of himself in a box and set the box aside. He was not bitter about it, or he had worked hard to stop being bitter about it. He was simply a man who had learned that the ranch came first, and that he was not good at reading the hidden motives of people who wanted something other than what they said they wanted. Alice wanted exactly what she said she wanted. He could see that clearly. She wanted to do her work well. She wanted to be treated as a professional. She wanted the respect that was due to her competence. Those were not hidden wants. They were front-facing and honest, and the transparency of them made him feel safer around her than he had felt around anyone in 3 years, which made the growing warmth he felt toward her approximately twice as alarming. He did not do anything about it. He was not a foolish man, and he understood that acting on a feeling that was still half-formed and new was the kind of impulsive behavior that led to catastrophe. He also understood, because he was paying attention, that Alice Langley was a woman who had learned to be guarded, and that the guarding was not unfriendliness but protection, and that breaking through it would require not charm or pressure but time and consistency, which were 2 things he was constitutionally able to provide. So he was patient. He talked to her about the ranch. He asked her opinion on things, not performatively, not to make her feel included, but because her opinion was actually worth having. He deferred to her judgment on herd management because it was better than his own in several specific ways, and he did not pretend otherwise, because pretending about things like that cost him nothing except the embarrassment of false pride, which he had decided years ago was a poor investment. Something was changing between them. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not from one specific sign, but from the accumulation of small signals that added up to a certain inevitability. The moment it became impossible to ignore was 3 weeks in, on a Wednesday evening when a summer lightning storm rolled in off the plains with the speed and fury that Texas storms specialized in. Alice had ridden out that afternoon with Hector to check on a group of young cattle in the south pasture that had been restless and showing signs of drift, and she had not returned when the storm front hit. Luke was on the porch watching the light go dark and green with that particular stormlight that meant serious wind and rain and possibly worse, and something in his chest tightened in a way that was not general anxiety but specific, directional anxiety pointed like a compass needle toward the south pasture. He saddled up and rode out into the building storm without thinking about it carefully enough to decide whether it was wise, which was, he would reflect later, somewhat telling. He found Alice and Hector half a mile south of the creek bend, working to get the young cattle through a gap in the fence before the storm broke fully. The thunder was rolling continuous now, low and heavy, and the cattle were half panicked, milling and pushing in the wrong direction. Hector was at the back of the herd, pressing them forward, and Alice was at the gap itself, cracking a coiled rope against the ground to redirect a stubborn steer that had planted itself sideways in the gap and was blocking the rest. Luke came in from the east and took the far side of the herd without needing to be told where to go. The 3 of them worked together wordlessly, the way good hands learn to do, reading each other's position and movement the way a dancing partner reads weight and timing. And in 20 minutes the cattle were through, and the fence gap was makeshift blocked with a section of deadfall that Hector found and Alice positioned with the confident practicality of someone who had done this kind of field improvisation before. Then the rain hit, real rain, hard and cold and horizontal, and they were all three soaked in 60 seconds, and there was nothing to do but ride for the barn at a pace that was fast enough to be purposeful and slow enough to be safe in the wet dark. They made it to the barn and came in out of the rain, horses steaming, all three of them dripping, and Hector took the horses with the unspoken tact of a man who had noticed something in the way the two people he worked for were looking at each other, and was choosing to give them approximately 10 minutes before he came back. He disappeared into the far stall with an elaborate focus on the horses that fooled nobody. Alice was wringing water from the end of her braid, which she had unpinned at some point during the riding, and the dark wet hair hung past her shoulder blades, and she looked entirely unlike the composed, precise manager who ran morning meetings, and more like the girl who had kept a ranch running at 17 through sheer refusal to stop. And Luke was looking at her and feeling something in his chest that was not at all ambiguous. "That steer," he said. She looked up. "The one who blocked the gap." "Yes, he is going to be trouble. He has that particular look that some cattle have that says they believe they are in charge." "I have a few of those," Luke said. "Cattle, I mean." "I know you meant cattle," Alice said, and her tone was dry and warm at the same time, and the corner of her mouth was doing something that was very close to a smile but maintaining deniability. They were standing perhaps 4 feet apart in the warm smell of horse and hay and rain, and the storm drummed on the barn roof with a steady, hypnotic persistence, and Luke thought very carefully about what he was going to say next. "Alice," he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him with those eyes that were always honest. "All right. When you arrived," he said, "I was rude to you. I said I was sorry for that and I meant it, but I want to say something more than that." He took a breath. He was not a man who spoke easily about the interior workings of himself, but he had decided that this was a situation that required honesty in the same way that a thirsty field required water, not because it was comfortable, but because without it something important would die. "I was not just surprised that you were a woman. I was afraid." Alice was quiet, listening. "I have had bad luck with trust," he said, and immediately knew that was an understatement of almost comic inadequacy, but he pressed on. "I built this place from nothing, and I trusted a man for 4 years who was robbing me blind. And before that I trusted people who let me down in other ways. I have spent a long time telling myself that the answer to all of that was to be more careful, to need less from people, to keep things simple." He looked at her. "And then you arrived, and in about 45 minutes you reorganized my entire operation and showed me that my water rights were broader than I knew, and I realized that the thing I was afraid of was not being taken advantage of again. The thing I was afraid of was the opposite." Alice was very still. "What is the opposite?" she said quietly. "That someone good would show up, and I would have to admit that I had been doing everything alone because I was afraid, not because it was necessary." The rain on the roof. Hector, invisible but auditable, very carefully, deliberately, brushing a horse with the loud thoroughness of a man who was broadcasting his presence and his intention to remain there for at least several more minutes. Alice looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, the same focused patience she brought to every problem, weighing it honestly, not rushing to a conclusion. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally, "and I want to match it." She looked down for a moment, then back up. "I came here to do a job. That is what I told myself, and that is true. But I have learned the hard way, the only way things actually get learned, to be very careful about what I let myself want beyond the job." Her jaw was steady, but her eyes were very direct. "Because I have been in situations where what I wanted was used against me, where my feeling of safety in a place turned out to be contingent on something I did not know about, and when that contingency failed, I was left with nothing, a beat. So I am careful." "I know," Luke said. "I see that you are. And I am not asking you to stop being careful." He looked at her steadily. "I am only telling you the truth of where I am, because I think you deserve the truth, and because I would rather say it plainly and have you decide what to do with it than not say it and have it sit between us, making everything complicated." A pause that was full and warm, not empty. "That is a very sensible approach," Alice said, and the quiet smile was fully visible now, something real and private, the smile of someone who had been hoping for exactly this kind of straightforward honesty without quite letting herself admit the hoping. "All right, Luke. I understand where you are." A pause. I am not very far behind you." He felt the warmth of that statement move through him from the shoulders down. He did not reach for her, did not push for anything more. That was not who he was, and it was not what this required. What this required was exactly what he had said: time and honesty, and the slow building of something real on the foundation of what they had already established. Hector emerged from the back stall with the timing of a man who had impeccable instincts. "Horses are settled," he said, to no one in particular. "Storm is passing." He did not look at either of them, but there was something in the set of his mouth that suggested he was deeply satisfied with the evening's developments. They walked back to the main house through the last of the rain, and Luke held the porch door open for her, and she went in with a simple thank you that was warmer than the words themselves. And that night Luke lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm finish itself over the plains and thinking that hope, when you let yourself feel it again after keeping it locked away, had a specific physical sensation in the chest, not comfortable exactly, but alive. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Luke could remember in years, which was saying something because they were also objectively the hardest weeks operationally, with the fall roundup approaching, and the cattle count still requiring reconciliation, and the south pasture fence needing a full replacement section that cost money Luke did not quite have yet. But hard and good are not mutually exclusive. He had forgotten that, somewhere in the years of building the double M alone, he had let those categories become fixed opposites. Alice reminded him that they were not. She was everywhere during the roundup preparation. She organized the branding schedule with a logic that reduced wasted time by nearly a third. She negotiated with a neighboring rancher, a man named Thurlow, who had been occasionally moving his fence line toward the double M's boundary in small increments that Hicks had never challenged. And she did it not with confrontation, but with a courtesy so precise and well documented that Thurlow found himself agreeing to pull the fence back to its legal boundary before he had quite noticed that was what was happening. She was present at the morning brandings, working alongside the hands, not to prove something but because she genuinely liked the work, and the crew had by now entirely reorganized their understanding of her. She was no longer something to be watched with wariness. She was their foreman, plain and simple, and she had their confidence the way a good foreman earns it, through demonstrated knowledge and consistent fairness. Roy Anders said it most plainly. One evening when Luke was patching a section of harness near the barn, and Roy was nearby working on a saddle. "She knows her cattle," Roy said, unprompted, in the way of a man who has been sitting on an opinion for a while and has finally decided it is settled enough to express. "That Alice Langley, she knows her cattle and she knows her horses and she knows how to read the range. I have worked for 3 different outfits. I never worked for a woman before. I did not think it would be the same. It is better." He went back to his saddle and did not say anything else, and Luke filed it away with the feeling of a man who is privately, deeply, unreasonably pleased. What Luke and Alice had between them was growing with the patient deliberateness of something that neither of them was rushing, but both of them were tending. They talked genuinely, extensively, in the mornings over the office work, and in the evenings after the crew had turned in, and the night sounds of the ranch. The crickets and the distant cattle and the occasional soft nicker from the barn replaced the day sounds. They talked about the land and the work, and about the things they had hoped for, and the things they had lost, and the way loss either makes you smaller or forces you, eventually, to become larger. And they were both of them people who had chosen the latter option, though it had cost. Luke told her about Alina. Not with drama, but simply the way you describe a scar to a doctor, not because it still hurts, but because it is part of the anatomy and the other person should know. He told her about the way Alina had seemed to love the ranch and then revealed, gradually, that what she had actually loved was the idea of a prosperous ranch, and the gap between the idea and the reality of daily hard work and frontier isolation had widened until she chose to close it by leaving. "I spent about a year thinking it was my fault," he said, "that I had not been enough, that the ranch was too much and I was too little. Then I stopped thinking that because it was not accurate, and being inaccurate about things is expensive." He looked at Alice. "But it made me careful about reading people's actual wants." "That is reasonable," Alice said. They were sitting on the porch after a long day, the sky going indigo over the plains, the stars coming up one by one. "Though there is a cost to it if you become so careful that you stop believing what people show you." He looked at her sidelong. "Is that what you think I do?" "I think you did," she said. "I think you are stopping." He was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" he said. "What made you careful?" She was quiet too, longer than he was. She had her hands loose in her lap, looking at the horizon. "There was a man in Cimarron," she said. "Foreman at the Hargrove spread. He was kind to me for a long time, and I thought it was honest. I thought he saw me as I actually was." She paused. "He saw a woman who was good at her job and who had no family connections and no money and no one to speak for her, which made her very available for certain kinds of taking advantage. When I realized it, I felt more foolish than I did hurt, which is perhaps worse." Her voice was steady, but there was something under it that was not quite steady. "He tried to claim to Mr. Hargrove that the ranch's improved performance during my tenure was primarily due to his guidance, that it was his management decisions that had produced the results, and that I had only been implementing his vision." A pause. Mr. Hargrove did not believe him, to his credit. "But the man's hidden motive, that I was a credential for him to steal, not a person to respect, that taught me something." She turned to look at Luke. "I learned to watch for what people want to take from you under the cover of appearing to give." Luke looked at her directly, steadily, with no deflection. "I want to take nothing from you under cover of anything," he said. "What I want is what I can see plainly, which is the company of someone honest and capable and genuinely interesting, in whatever form that takes, at whatever pace makes sense." He paused. "I am not in a hurry, and I am not pretending." Alice held his gaze. "I know," she said, and there was something in those two words that was final in the way that good settlements are final, not forced, but concluded. That night, after she had gone inside and he sat alone for a while with the stars, Luke Mercer thought very carefully about the fact that Alice Langley was the first person in 3 years with whom he had been fully honest, and he thought about the cost of that honesty, and he decided that whatever the cost was, it was the right expenditure. The fall roundup was everything Alice had organized it to be. 6 days of hard work across 3,000 acres, the crew running like a well-kept watch, every man knowing his role and working it. The final count came back at 212 head over the original adjusted estimate. Alice had correctly predicted that several groups of cattle were sheltering in brushy draws that the previous counting method had missed, which meant the Double M's actual herd was substantially larger than the post-Hicks accounting had suggested. She brought the final numbers to Luke on the 6th evening, when the crew was washing up and the smell of the cook fire mixed with the smell of horse and dust and fresh branding iron in the cool October air, and she laid the tally sheet on the table in front of him the way she always laid documents, precisely, without ceremony, the information speaking for itself. Luke looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "These are solid," he said. "They are solid," she agreed. "You found 200 head more than I thought I had." 212. The count includes the young stock in the South Draws, which had not been properly documented. She sat down across from him. "At current market, if you take 3/4 of the mature herd to market before winter, you will recover the Hicks shortfall and carry the Double M through the winter with a healthy reserve." She looked at him steadily. "You are not in trouble, Luke. You were never as far in trouble as you thought." He absorbed that. Something relaxed in his face that had been tightly held since the morning he fired Hicks, some chronic bracing against the worst that had been his constant companion through the weeks. He let it go now, watching it leave. I spent 6 months believing the worst possible version of this situation, he said slowly. People do that. It feels like preparation. She tilted her head. It isn't usually. It is usually just suffering in advance. He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. She smiled fully, and in the lamplight her face was warm and clear, and the smile reached her eyes completely, and he thought, there it is. That was the thing he had been learning to see since the first morning, the real face of her, under the professional composure and the hard-learned guarding, and it was extraordinary. He reached across the table, not fast, and covered her hand with his. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face and did not move away. "Alice," he said. "Yes," she said, in a tone that answered a question he had not quite asked yet but clearly should. He stood up, came around the table, and she stood too, and he took her face in both hands very carefully. The way you handle something you know is precious and not fragile but want to treat as if it were, and he kissed her. And she kissed him back with a warmth and a directness that was entirely her own, no performance, no hesitation, simply the honest expression of a feeling honestly held. When they stepped back from each other, both of them a little breathless and very still, Luke said, "I should have said something sooner." "You said it at the right time," Alice told him. There is no sooner and later with these things. There is only the right moment when both people are ready. He kept her hands in his for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight. "I do not want to complicate your position here," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Your work here is yours. What we are, whatever this is, that is separate." "I appreciate that," she said. "And I will tell you clearly, the work is mine, and I know the difference between my professional standing and my personal life. I am not confused about that." A pause. "Are you?" "No," he said. "I am not confused about anything right now, for the first time in quite a while." She squeezed his hands once and then released them. "I think we should tell no one yet," she said practically. "The crew respects me because they see my work. I would like that to remain the primary thing they see." He agreed with this completely. "However long you think is right," he said. She nodded. "Now, I have some thoughts about the cattle transport logistics to redemption that we should go over before tomorrow." He stared at her. "You want to talk about cattle transport?" She met his eyes with an expression of complete innocence that was completely manufactured, and both of them knew it. "I believe that is generally what people discuss at the end of a successful roundup." He pulled out a chair, sat back down, and pulled the transport map toward him, and she sat across from him and opened her notebook, and they spent the next hour talking about cattle logistics, and it was simultaneously the most professional and the most romantic hour he had experienced in years, and he was deeply aware of both things at once. The cattle drive to redemption took 4 days. Luke and 3 of the hands, Hector, Bill, and Roy, pushed 204 head along the trail north toward the market town, while Alice stayed at the Double M with the remaining hands to oversee the late-season fence work and the winter preparation. They had discussed this division of labor thoroughly and agreed it was the best use of resources. Luke had proposed it. He had not admitted, even to himself, how much he had wanted to ask her to come on the drive, because the image of her on horseback in the open country was one he had been living with pleasurably for several weeks. But the ranch needed management, and she was better qualified than anyone else to provide it in his absence, so the logic was clear. He missed her company with a specificity that surprised him. Not generally, not in the vague way you miss familiar things, but precisely the way you miss the particular quality of light in a room when you are in a different room. He missed the morning conversations, and the way she framed problems, and the dry, careful humor, and the amber hazel eyes that were always honest even when they were careful. He found himself thinking about things he wanted to tell her, small observations about the terrain or the behavior of a particular cow or the character of the sunset, and making mental notes that he knew were ridiculous and found he did not care. In redemption, he got a good price for the cattle. The town had grown considerably in the years since the railroad had established its closer approach, and the stockyards were busy and well run. And by the end of the second day in town, he had a bank draft for more money than he had expected, which was a feeling he had not had in quite a long time. He stood in the street outside the Redemption National Bank with the draft in his coat pocket and the October sun on his face and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely secure. Not comfortable, secure. The double M was going to be all right. He found a general store and bought several things he had not intended to buy: supplies, yes, but also a book about soil management that he thought Alice would find interesting, and a small length of dark green ribbon that was not a supply item by any useful definition, but which was exactly the color of the skirt she had been wearing the morning she arrived, and which he purchased with the slightly defiant composure of a man doing something he knows is sentimental and deciding it is all right. He wrote her a letter that evening from the hotel room. Not a long letter, he was not a florid correspondent, but an honest one. He told her the cattle had sold well. He told her he had found the book. He told her that the sunset over the plains on the third night of the drive had been the particular red-orange color that the plains did in October, and that he had thought she should have seen it. He read the letter back, decided it said what he meant it to say, and sealed it and sent it with the Morning Post. When he rode back into the Double M yard 4 days later, the winter preparation was 40% complete. The bunkhouse had been insulated against the coming cold. The horse barn had been cleaned and organized so efficiently that Pete Callahan had reportedly walked in the first morning and stood in silence for 30 seconds before saying, "This is very good," which was Pete's version of a standing ovation. The fence crew had completed 2 of the 3 remaining sections. Alice had also begun a kitchen garden near the main house, not a large one, but a practical fall planting of root vegetables that would supplement the winter provisions. He came into the yard at dusk on the 4th day, and she was in the kitchen garden, kneeling beside a row with a small trowel, and she heard the hoofbeats and stood up and turned toward the gate, and when he rode through, she did not wave or call out, but she watched him with an expression of such genuine, unguarded gladness that something in his chest that had been compressed for most of the past week simply released. He dismounted, handed the reins to Tommy, and walked to the garden fence. Alice was still looking at him. He had the book under his arm. "Cattle sold well," he said. "I received your letter," she said. "I am glad. The winter prep looks good." He looked at the garden. The potatoes were a good idea. "Turnips," she said, gesturing. "Carrots there, potatoes at the end." She looked at the book under his arm. "Is that for me?" He handed it over the fence. She looked at the title, and her expression did exactly what he had hoped: the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, combined with the particular pleasure of being understood. "Soil management," she said, "for the spring pasture rotation. I thought it might be useful." She held it for a moment and then looked at him, and the gladness was back, fuller and less guarded. "Thank you," she said, and they looked at each other over the low garden fence in the October dusk, with the sound of the ranch settling into its evening quiet around them. And it was the most uncomplicated and complete happiness that Luke had felt since the early years when the Double M was new, and possibility had not yet learned to be afraid of itself. The winter came in hard in January, the way Texas winters sometimes did, not with the prolonged gray misery of the northern states, but with periodic brutal cold snaps that hit fast and demanded immediate response. Alice had prepared for them with the thoroughness of someone who had wintered cattle before and knew the cost of complacency. The feed stores were sufficient. The windbreaks were reinforced. The herd had been consolidated into manageable pastures with shelter access. When the first cold snap came in mid-January, freezing the water troughs overnight, the crew had the protocol already in place and moved through the morning response with smooth efficiency. Luke and Alice worked through those winter days in the comfortable closeness of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms, who moved around each other without colliding, who knew when to push and when to let the other person think. Their relationship had deepened quietly, as winter deepened quietly, less visible than the spring and summer versions of things, but more fundamental. They were together in the evenings more openly now. The crew had understood for some time, in the unspoken way of people who work closely together and observe carefully, and no one had said anything except Hector, who had said to Luke one afternoon with the gravity of a man making a formal pronouncement, "She is a good woman," and Luke had said, "I know," and Hector had nodded and gone back to his work with the satisfied air of someone who had said the necessary thing. On a quiet February evening, with snow on the ground outside and a good fire in the main house, and the remains of supper on the table between them, and a lamp throwing warm light over the pages they had both stopped reading, Luke said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it plainly." Alice looked up from her book. She had the green ribbon in her hair. She had been wearing it since he gave it to her, not every day, but often enough that he had come to associate it with a particular mood of hers, comfortable and private. "All right," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I want to ask if you would be willing to make this permanent. The ranch, the partnership, all of it." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me." She put her book down. She looked at him for a long moment, not the weighing, cautious look of someone assessing a risk, but the full, clear-eyed look of someone who has already assessed and is simply taking the full measure of the thing. "Luke," she said, "you do not have to answer immediately." "I know I do not. I am going to anyway." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, I am willing. I would like that very much." He reached across the table and she took his hand and he held it, not dramatically. Just held it, in the warm room with the fire going and the snow outside, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence was already full. They were married in April, when the land greened up and the whole country smelled like possibility, in a ceremony in the small church at Redemption attended by the crew, the neighboring families, and a circuit preacher named Father Hannigan who had known Luke's father and who cried briefly but controllably during the vows, and then shook both their hands with tremendous vigor, and said it was the most sensible marriage he had witnessed in 30 years of ministry, which they both chose to take as a compliment. Alice wore a dress of dark blue with cream lace at the collar that she had ordered from a seamstress in Redemption, and her hair was pinned up with the green ribbon worked into it, and she looked like herself, not like a bride in the general category, but like Alice Langley on a particular significant morning, composed and direct and entirely present, with that almost smile that Luke knew now was not almost anything but was simply her smile, the real one. The one she gave when she was genuinely happy. Luke wore his good dark coat and his best boots, and he stood at the front of that small church looking at her walk toward him and felt the specific, irreversible feeling of a man who knows he is exactly where he should be, doing exactly the right thing at the right time with the right person. Their vows were simple. The preacher asked if they would take each other. They both said yes, without hesitation. The reception afterward was held in the field behind Hector's bunkhouse, because Hector had quietly organized it over the preceding week with the other hands, and there was food and a fiddle player from town and several hours of the kind of easy, genuine celebration that comes when people who have worked hard together are given a reason to rest and enjoy what they have built. Tommy Briggs danced with 3 different women from neighboring properties and managed to knock over a punch bowl, which surprised no one. Bill Sandover told Luke, with the gruff sincerity of a man who does not say things he does not mean, that the Double M was a better ranch than it had been in years, and that he planned to stay as long as Luke would have him. Jimmy Creek offered Alice a carved wooden horse no bigger than a fist. He had made it himself over the winter evenings. She later learned and pressed it into her hand with a rare, brief smile and said, "For the ranch," which was his way of saying something much larger. Luke and Alice rode home in the late afternoon ahead of the others and came into the yard as the spring light went long and golden over the grass, and the horses let themselves into the corral with the ease of animals who knew exactly where they belonged, and the ranch was quiet around them, warm and alive, and Alice stood in the yard looking at it all. The house, the barn, the fence lines she had repaired, and the pastures she had managed, and the land that now was part of what she had, and she felt something she had not felt since the bank took her father's property 10 years ago. Home. Luke came up beside her and she leaned into him, and his arm came around her without a word, and they stood there for a while in the April evening and let themselves feel it. The first year of their marriage was full in every sense. They worked the ranch together with the same focused, complementary energy they had developed before, but with an ease now, a settled quality, the difference between two instruments that have been tuning toward each other and two instruments that have finally found the chord. Alice continued as ranch manager. That had never been in question. Luke ran the broader business operations, the cattle market relationships, the land management decisions that required negotiation with county officials and neighboring spreads, and they consulted each other on everything, not from obligation, but from the genuine recognition that two minds that thought differently about the same problem produced better solutions than either mind alone. In the summer of that first year, the water rights question Alice had identified in the original deed survey was formally resolved in their favor. A lawyer in redemption named Garrett, a careful, thorough young man who reminded Alice slightly of Jimmy Creek in his economy of words and economy of motion, took the case to the county land office and produced such a well-documented argument that the hearing lasted 40 minutes, which Garrett said was the fastest land rights ruling he had ever seen. The South Pasture Creek access was officially Double M property, and the water that had been disputed for years was now theirs. The difference it made to the ranch was substantial. With reliable year-round water access in the South Range, they could extend the grazing rotation significantly, which reduced feed costs and allowed them to carry a larger herd through dry seasons. Alice recalculated the carrying capacity of the land and determined they could add 60 to 70 head without straining resources, which she presented to Luke over the morning coffee in the way she always presented significant proposals. Clearly, with numbers, with her own recommendation already formed but stated as a recommendation rather than a decision, because they had agreed in the early weeks of their marriage that major ranch decisions were joint decisions. Luke read through her numbers, nodded slowly, and said, "Add 65. 65 is a good number," she agreed. He looked at her with that particular look, the one she had come to know as his version of warmth, the look that lived in the slight relaxation around his eyes and the quality of attention rather than in any more obvious expression. "You already decided before you presented it," he said. "I recommended," she said. "You recommended 65, and you are going to make 65 sound like a mutual decision." She met his eyes. "Is it not a mutual decision? You agreed." He laughed and reached for her hand across the table. "I agreed because you are almost always right about these things, and also because I like agreeing with you." He held her hand for a moment, for purely selfish reasons. She turned her hand in his. "The most honest thing you have said all morning." In the autumn of that first year, Alice told Luke she was expecting a child. She told him on a Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. In the direct, calm way, she told him most important things without preamble, but with the full attention of someone who understood the weight of the moment. He sat across from her, and for a moment he could not speak, and she watched him process it, watched the shock become recognition, become something that was not quite joy in the usual loud sense, but was something more complete, a fullness in his face, a settling, as if every loose element of himself had just found the gravity it had been looking for. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which she later told him was the right first question. "I am entirely well," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then carefully, "I am very glad." "So am I." He took her hands in both of his across the table, the way he had on the night in February by the fire, and held them. They stayed like that for a while, with the autumn light coming in through the east window, and the sound of the ranch beginning its day outside. The child was born in May of 1888, a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first hours of a determined look that Alice said was purely his father's and Luke said was purely his mother's, and both of them were probably right. They named him James Edward Mercer, James for Alice's father and Edward for Luke's, and he arrived into a household that was ready for him in every practical way Alice had prepared. Because she had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, with foresight and thoroughness and lists, and in every emotional way that perhaps neither of them had entirely anticipated, which is to say completely. Hector, who had by that point been at the Double M for over a decade and showed no signs of leaving, held the baby on the second day with a careful solemnity and said, "He will know this land," and Alice said, "He will know this land," and it sounded like a covenant. The Double M continued to grow. Not wildly, not recklessly, but with the steady, well-managed expansion of a ranch that was run by people who understood land and animals and labor and money, and the careful balance of all four. By the summer of 1889, they had expanded the herd to its new full carrying capacity, and had hired 2 additional hands, a former Union Pacific worker named Samuel Grant, who had decided he preferred cattle to trains, and a young Mexican vaquero named Pablo Reyes, who was Hector's nephew, and who could ride anything that moved. Alice had taken on the full accounting function after verifying that the system she had built in the first weeks was sound, and the books were a model of clarity that made the annual bank review something the Double M looked forward to rather than dreaded. Dale Hicks, Luke learned through a mutual acquaintance in Redemption, had moved west and was working as a horse trader in New Mexico. Luke had decided, ultimately, not to bring the theft to the sheriff, not out of sentimentality, but out of the practical recognition that the energy required to pursue it was better spent on the ranch, and that Alice's recovery of the financial situation meant the damage, while real, was not ruinous. He made that decision with Alice's input. She had said, "Your call, but if you prosecute, plan for 2 years of legal distraction. If you let it go, plan for that money to be gone. Which version of the future do you want to build?" He had said, "The second one," and that had been that. By the fall of 1889, 3 years after Alice Langley had climbed off a stagecoach and reorganized his ranch in 45 minutes, Luke Mercer had the most productive operation in the county, a healthy family, and a marriage that was, in the opinion of everyone who observed it, one of the great practical love stories of the Texas brush country, not dramatic in the showy way, but built on the deepest possible foundation. 2 people who were honest with each other, who respected each other's competence, who had both survived hard things and chosen not to let the hardness make them less, and who had found in each other the thing that all the careful guarding had been protecting the space for. In October of 1889, on the 3-year anniversary of the day Alice had arrived, Luke came into the office early in the morning, earlier than she was, for once, and set a mug of coffee on her desk and a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers from the south pasture beside it. He had been up before dawn to pick them, which he would never admit, and which she knew instantly when she came in and found them. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the flowers and the coffee and the morning light coming in over the land they had made together, and something in her chest moved that was not sentiment exactly, but the particular gratitude of someone who had wanted something for a long time and had waited and been careful and not given up on it, and had finally received it not in spite of the waiting but because of it. She sat down, picked up the coffee, looked at the flowers. Luke came in behind her and sat in his usual chair across the desk. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she agreed. I should have apologized faster, he said. She looked at him with the smile, the real one. You apologized at the right time, I keep telling you that. You also had my crew working before I could apologize, which was somewhat pointed. It was practical, she said. The crew needed direction. They needed you, he said. I needed you. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug with gray eyes that were warm in a way they had not been 3 years ago, that had learned to be warm in the years since that she had watched learn it. "I still do." She held his gaze with the directness that was the core of her, the thing that had been there from the beginning and had never changed, and she said, "That is convenient, because I intend to stay." Outside, the fall sun was coming fully up over the Texas plains, burning off the morning cold, turning the grass gold and the sky that deep, particular blue that you only get in October when the heat of summer is finally done. In the yard, Hector was directing Pablo in the morning feeding with the unhurried authority of a man who knows his domain completely. Tommy, no longer quite as young and considerably less likely to knock things over, was checking the horses with competent attention. James Edward Mercer, 17 months old and recently arrived at the opinion that he should be allowed to walk everywhere unassisted, was making his determined, slightly unstable way across the porch with a seriousness of purpose that was unmistakably his mother's. Alice became aware of him through the window. She stood up from her desk with the fluid speed of a woman who has developed a sixth sense for toddler trajectories, and went to the door, and Luke followed, and they stood together on the porch as their son made his way carefully toward the steps with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet fully encountered the concept of failure. Alice went down one step and held out her hands, and James looked at her hands and then at the step between them and then at his mother's face, and made his decision, and stepped down with the courage of someone who trusted completely that the hands would be there. They were there. They were always there. Luke stood on the porch above them, watching his wife kneel in the morning light with their son, and felt the full, quiet, extraordinary weight of his life. Everything it had cost, everything it had become, the dark past and the hard years and the morning 3 years ago when he had been broken and furious and alone, and a stagecoach had arrived carrying something he had not known he was waiting for. He had fired his foreman that morning and thought he was beginning his worst day. He had been wrong. He had been beginning the best chapter he would ever know. Alice looked up from James and found Luke watching them, and the smile she gave him then was the one that still reached her eyes completely, the one she kept for real moments, and he thought, as he had thought many times in the years since, there it is. In the spring of 1891, their second child arrived, a girl this time, with Alice's dark hair and Luke's gray eyes, who was named Eliza Ruth Mercer, and who entered the world with an air of calm assessment that suggested she had taken one look around and decided everything was satisfactory, which made her parents feel, simultaneously, that she was entirely her mother's daughter and that they were already slightly in awe of her. James, who was 3 by then, examined his new sister with enormous seriousness, and then announced to his mother that the baby was acceptable, which Alice reported to Luke with a completely straight face, and which Luke subsequently retold to Hector and Bill Sandover, with the barely suppressed delight of a man who had discovered that fatherhood was one of the better surprises life had to offer. The double M in those years became what Alice had seen it could be on the morning she arrived, a ranch running at its full capacity, not strained or struggling or held together by improvisation, but stable, solid, the product of careful management and honest work, and the consistent application of knowledge and effort to land that rewarded both. The crew that Alice had redirected on that first morning had grown, but its core remained Hector, who was something between a colleague and family at this point, Bill Sandover, who had decided that the Double M was the best ranch he had ever worked and that he saw no reason to look elsewhere, Jimmy Creek, who was still quiet and still saw everything, and even Tommy Briggs, who had grown into a steady, capable hand, and who had, in the opinion of most observers, been primarily shaped by the combination of Alice's management and Luke's example, which was perhaps the finest tribute either of them had ever received. The land records were clean. The books were honest. The water rights were clear. The cattle were healthy and well managed. The fence lines were maintained. The horses were sound. And in the evenings, after the work was done and the children were in bed, and the ranch had settled into its night rhythms, Luke and Alice sat on the porch of the house he had rebuilt and she had helped make whole, and they talked, or read, or were quiet together in the particular piece of people who have found what they were looking for and know it. And the stars came up over the Texas plains in their thousands, enormous and closed the way they are only in wide country, and the land spread out in the dark around them. Theirs in every way that mattered. Luke reached for her hand, the way he still did, had done hundreds of times, would do hundreds of times more, and she gave it to him without looking up from her book, with the ease of someone doing a thing so natural it required no thought. Outside, the double M breathed around them, the cattle settled in the south pasture, the horses quiet in the barn, the fence lines holding, the water flowing where it should, the records kept and the land known and the work continuing as it always would, and it was good, and it was theirs, and it was enough and more than enough. It was everything.